Welcome, everybody, to episode, I think we're going to call this episode 38, actually, of the podcast, Bill.
I think that's right.
I'm Tom Joscelyn. I'm a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and I'm joined, as usual, by my partner in crime, Bill Roggio. Bill, you want to say hi, besides the, agreeing with me on the numbering of our podcast here?
Hello, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year to everyone.
So this episode is a little bit different. We're just doing sort of, it's meant to be in good humor, but with some serious stuff. It's sort of, we've joked about this in previous episodes of the podcast that we were going to do an airing of the grievances. And if you remember back to the Seinfeld series, of which I'm a fan, there was the Festivus episode where Frank Costanza infamously has his own holiday that he basically invents during the holiday season. And part of it is that, everybody gets to air their grievances. And we're going to do the same thing in the same sort of, style, I guess. It's sort of, half-hearted, it's half joking, but also half serious. But, as I was sitting down to sort of plan this out for this week, not that there's any serious planning that went into this, just sort of, I guess, thinking about it while walking around, right, Bill?
Yeah.
As I was thinking about this week, I thought, look, in reality, personally, I don't have any grievances. 2020 has been an incredibly rough year for a lot of people. You look at the toll that COVID, the coronavirus, has taken. You look at the toll on the economy. You look at all of the economic dislocation, all the problems people are facing. You look at the lives that are lost in the different, combat theaters that Bill and I cover, war zones that we cover, and sort of everything that goes on in those places. And, really, overall, personally, I don't have any grievances. The world is a chaotic mess right now, and there's a lot of horrible stuff going on. And, I guess basically I would open this episode by saying this is really meant to be sort of half in jest, half serious, because on a personal level, I don't really have anything to complain about and shouldn't complain about anything. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, Tom, you're absolutely right. I mean, given what's going on, I would say me and my family are blessed to be where we are today. And we certainly, we feel for everyone out here who's been impacted by Corona, by the current conflicts or whatever hardships you're facing. I know, Tom, you and your family and mine, we wish you all the best this year.
Absolutely.
Upcoming year.
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, we wish everybody the best, except for the haters, I guess. No. I mean, I guess, no. I guess we wish everybody.
I'll be
generous. All right. We wish everybody. We wish everybody the best. We don't wish any ill will for anyone, really. But when we're talking about the area of grievances, what we're talking about are sort of different things that we've come across in our careers doing this, and we've been doing this for a long time now. And, I jotted down several things that sort of still my pet peeves or bug me. And I guess I'll make those my grievances. And I think you've got a couple as well, Bill.
Correct. I do.
The first thing on my list, and again, this is sort of goes to the heart of what we do and how we do our work, is that, part of what I always struggle with is that there's really no room in a lot of the discussions of these issues that we work on when it comes to jihadism and the reaction, the sort of post 9/11 world that we live in. There's no room or little room for ambivalence. When I say ambivalence, it means holding contradictory ideas in mind and sort of having opinions that basically are inconsistent with one another because you sort of are, indeed ambivalent about what's going on. I think that comes through in our discussions of Afghanistan, for example. We have deep ambivalence there. It's not exactly a situation where we're gung ho about anything. But on really all these issues, I sort of ambivalent, and that's sort of something that I think a lot of times in the Washington policy debates doesn't come through. Everything sort of gets boiled down to a sort of a binary sort of debate or discussion, and a lot of times the sort of nuance or the tensions in various arguments aren't really explored. And part of the reason why we started this podcast was because, sometimes or a lot of times it doesn't really come through in the writing. I've tried over time to basically put more of the uncertainty, more of the ambivalence into my own writing when it comes to policy. Now, a lot of times I'm not writing about policy. Most of the time I'm writing about just sort of trying to figure out what's going on. And there's a bifurcation of those two things that I think everybody should focus on, and we try and focus on. And I think a lot of people don't, but we try to. But what do you think about that, Bill, as my first sort of grievance on all this?
Tom, I could not agree with you more. As you said, binary thinking is prevalent. There's no room for nuance. I think Afghanistan really is the perfect case. The point that you make about policy versus facts, I could not agree more. You and I are have been strong advocates for getting the facts right, for looking at these groups, and then coming up with drawing a proper view of who our enemy is, what they're about, what their goals, what their tactics, what their strategy is, and then developing a policy. Whereas often what we see in Washington is the opposite. Let's just define our policy outcome that we hope to achieve, and then we'll fill in the blanks. We'll backfill in the blanks. There's one thing I'm not ambivalent on, Tom. I will say is I am not ambivalent on pressing the fight against our enemies, our true enemies. They do not deserve my forgiveness, and I do not wish them a safe and happy New Year. And I'll just leave it at that.
But when and where you do that and how you do it, that's where the ambivalence comes into play, and how you define
Exactly,
it. And that
Tom.
does that opens up a whole can of worms, right? I mean, that's the issue, right, on all this stuff. But ambivalence, and when I say ambivalence too, when I talk about that, I think, part of what's lost now, or is being lost, I guess, in the Western tradition is the tradition of skepticism, and somebody would say to me, times in my career, I've heard somebody say, "Oh, you're skeptical." Yeah, you should be skeptical of everything, right? Skepticism is sort of the way you start to get at the truth, right? It's not that one of the things I've been thinking about recently is it's not a matter of, I think there's some people that always have to be right, they always want to be right, or and I think that what I try and do, or what I want to do anyway, is I want to try and get it right. And so, there's a difference between being right and getting it right. And getting it right is a process. I mean, we certainly are far from perfect. I mean, that's, I don't think anybody would claim otherwise. I don't think anybody's perfect in their analysis, but getting it right is sort of a thing over time that you have to sort of work at. And that's part of the problem I have with sort of the policy debate on all this stuff and how these issues are discussed, is that everybody a lot of people anyway, I think when these issues are discussed, they sort of want to just pretend that they know with certainty that they're right about what they're saying and what they're recommending, when in reality, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're not ambivalent, if you're not skeptical, if you don't have doubt about what's going on in all these issues, then you're probably not really working very hard to get it right.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Tom. And you know what? The lack of skepticism, particularly amongst the press, when government officials are stating, supposed facts, repeating. I hate to use this again, Tom. I mean, God, ad nauseum we've discussed, but the 50 to 100 Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, for instance, you and I have said all along, we don't know what that number exactly is, but we know that 50 to 100 estimate that was given for 6 straight years was dead wrong. We knew that. And there was zero skepticism from the press. They just repeated it ad nauseum. We see the press constantly doing this, just repeating what government, they're essentially serving as stenographers instead of providing an analytic take of a skeptical view of what government officials are telling you. I mean, if one of the things I've learned over the years is I could tell which reporters rely on the exact same sources. I can't tell you who those sources are, but I could tell you I know that they're relying on the same people, because they'll get something wrong and they'll keep getting something wrong and they'll keep repeating it. As soon as someone tells me something and then I discover it's false, I have to turn around and reevaluate that person that I'm talking to and look at them and everything they say from that point on. And I'm not saying just getting something wrong in the sense of, there's big wrongs and there's small wrongs. Getting a number, particularly, over time, it's hard to explain here, but getting the overall view, getting the overall picture wrong and repeating it and saying it time and time again when it's proven to be wrong, that's when I know there's a big problem. We just don't see that type of skepticism from reporters, particularly. That's supposed to be their job, and I see it less and less and less.
Well, the interesting thing about, and that is like, this gets to my ambivalence on all this. When we talk about Afghanistan, for example, and getting it right in terms of what Al Qaeda is doing there and the presence there and the relationship with the Taliban, you know, it's long past time to get it right. I think. I don't think that anybody's going to get it right. And I certainly wouldn't base any policy recommendation on, the idea that we have to stay forever to get it right. I just don't. I just don't think that way. The point is that as the U.S. draws down from Afghanistan and presumably will leave in the coming months, I think upon departure, the U.S. should be clear-eyed about what's being left behind, something you and I have said numerous times, and again, that's presuming that there is a complete withdrawal. I mean, obviously, we're not in control policy, so we have no idea what the Biden team is exactly going to do, but we think obviously there's a significant chance of that anyway in the coming year for 2021. But the point is not, again, like, as long as, I think in terms of a policy recommendation on that, as long as the U.S. was there, we should have struggled to get that right. The U.S. should have worked to get that right. And the point is they didn't, and I don't think that's fixable now.
Yeah, Tom, and that'll get to my my next grievance. We may as well. I mean, and I have it listed as Zalmay Khalilzad, who's the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan's reconciliation. Basically, the guy who's tasked with signing the deal with the Taliban for so-called peace. We all know it's a withdrawal deal. I mean, please, Khalilzad, stop trying to sell us this false peace. There was just an attack in Ghazni, and lots of women and children were killed in this. And Khalilzad comes out with this 7-step tweet or tweet thread, and he condemns the attack, but he won't name the attacker. It's really interesting. And
he's done that. He's done that before, Bill. I mean,
he's done this time and time again, Tom. Yeah. And I'm tired of it. He can't name. He can't say that it's the Taliban. And in the same statement, he's intimating that the Afghan government is just as culpable in the death of Ghazni as the Taliban is, who tried to carry out the attack. He can't bring himself any longer to condemn the Taliban because all he sees is something that he thinks is peace. And
I don't even know if he thinks it's peace. He's selling whatever he's selling. Yeah, I mean, with Zalmay Khalilzad, I mean, a couple things. I mean, one, as you pointed out early on, you testified alongside him, and now he's contradicted himself in terms of all the main bullet points in his testimony that day, and he hasn't provided any good evidence for contradicting himself on all that. When it comes to the relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, he now vouches for the Taliban as a counterterrorism partner, or at least did in the deal that he signed in February 29th of 2020. That's on my grievance list too, because, again, I know we're repeating ourselves, but U.S. can leave Afghanistan without vouching for the Taliban, But there's a grievance here too when it comes to the view of diplomacy, which is that if there was real diplomatic gains to be made with talking with the Taliban, then sure, I'm not against talking to anybody, basically in principle. But it has to be rooted in an actual understanding of what's going on, who you're talking to, and what you're going to get out of it, and how you're going to go about doing it. And the truth of the matter is that that's not what happened here at all, right? I mean, the Taliban hasn't given up anything and has extracted concessions, and the U.S. has basically engaged in submissive, servile diplomacy with the Taliban. I mean, what interest does that serve, And vouching for the Taliban as our counterterrorism partners they've done, which is on my grievance list too. And we've talked about this all the time ad nauseum, so I don't want to dwell on it. But without any actual evidence from the Taliban that they're willing to change their behavior, strikes me as just absolutely bizarre, So I think the Biden team is confronted with a no-win situation in Afghanistan. I think Biden is sort of, President-elect Biden is sort of inclined to do what? I don't know, probably get out. But again, if you actually look at this deal, which, by the way, the deal also includes a clause, this is on my grievance list as well, saying the U.S. basically gives up, any opportunity to defend itself by committing threatening military action in Afghanistan forevermore as part of this deal. I mean, wow. So we're going to now say that the U.S. isn't going to have the right to self-defense to take out an Al-Qaeda terrorist who pops up in Afghanistan post-withdrawal, which is basically what the deal says, if you actually read the language in it. So this is all part of why, okay, you're going to get out of Afghanistan, get out. You don't need to whitewash the Taliban on the way out the door, which is what this effectively did. And I think I just gave a whole bunch of grievances probably in one.
I knew it when I mentioned Khalilzad, Tom. I kind of knew
it would
go down this rabbit hole.
You off.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right, exactly. And everyone calls this a peace deal, and I know we've referred it to a withdrawal deal. And the more I think of it, it's a surrender. I can't look at this thing as anything but a surrender to the Taliban. We're destroying equipment. We're gonna, because we can't get it out of the country quick enough because it's cheaper to do so. This isn't how if you negotiated a peace agreement with your adversary, this isn't how it would look. Everything that we're seeing, I hate to say it this way. I hate that 19 plus years of sacrifice of blood and treasure in Afghanistan has led to defeat, but I can't look at this any other way. And, defeat to the horrific Taliban, a horrible jihadist group that is going to enslave Afghans yet again. It's doing it already in areas under its control.
Without having any evidence of a break from Al Qaeda, which is the
Right.
principal selling point of this deal. I mean, that's what's so absurd about this whole thing. I mean, we're sitting here however many months out now from this, and the Trump administration sold it hard, this idea that the Taliban was now our counterterrorism partner against Al Qaeda, and there's just no evidence for that. There's no evidence for that at all.
And there's such ambivalence towards Afghanistan, or apathy towards Afghanistan here in the United States.
Well, there's apathy, yeah. I mean, the ambivalence I get. I'm ambivalent,
Apathy,
right? Yeah, I'm ambivalent.
yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point.
I got the wrong A word.
Yeah, no, it's all right. Apathy, apathy, I object to, but ambivalence, I get. I'm ambivalent, But the bottom line is, look, I don't think any of this is all. Part of why we're doing this podcast is I think people need to understand that just because we remain clear-eyed about the Taliban, and folks, we've remained clear-eyed about the Taliban when everybody else sort of started to see them through rose-colored glasses. That's our argument, but we defend that one vigorously. That doesn't mean
it's easy to do, Tom. I mean,
it's a pile of facts, a mountain of facts,
No one challenges us on this situation. They ignore us. They put us to the side, but they'll never debate us about this.
Well, no, I see people on Twitter and elsewhere. They have their talk.
That's not serious.
That's not serious. No, I mean, that's actually, we're going to get to Twitter as one of my grievances, by the way. But yeah, no, I mean, they have these talking points. The Taliban was never, I don't want to repeat it all. They didn't have any international objectives, just local. It's all, what happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan. No, we've debunked all that so many times. But but the bottom line is, it doesn't mean that we're itching for more war in Afghanistan or itching for more U.S. military involvement in the war, right? I mean, it's just, the thing is, we look at this as Americans who want to defend American interests and values and personnel around the globe. And, I mean, to be honest with you, I think if this is the thing too, some of my grievances too. Sometimes you have like the endless war crowd, doesn't like us because we don't fit with them ideologically. I don't know if we fit in with anybody ideologically now. But actually, if they were smart critics, right, or actually smart at using our stuff, they'd realize that there are a lot of criticisms here of America's warfighting post 9/11 that really draw into question the whole thing, and basically mean you should be, yes, indeed, very skeptical going forward about getting involved in any other conflict, right?
Yeah, Tom, that's exactly right. I mean, particularly for the isolationists, right? Which we're not, but if you look at what we're saying we don't fight wars properly, so why should we get into them? I mean, that's the argument an isolationist can make using our material. It's shocking that it's not done. Instead, they just say end the endless wars. But to me, it's really an issue. My concern with our involvement, we should always be very careful about where we do decide to commit U.S. blood and treasure, particularly blood. But there were times Afghanistan was required. Al Qaeda attacked us using Afghanistan as a base, and the Taliban refused.
And of course, the apologists have all sorts of excuses now for that.
They can go to hell.
Yeah,
Tom,
I'm with you, man. I'm with you. Yeah, no, they can. I mean, just start with the 9/11 Commission report and go through it, and
exactly.
Like anybody, actually, I saw somebody refer to these as the Imperial Wars the other day, and I won't say who, but I mean, what are you talking about? Like, who the hell wanted to be in Afghanistan prior to 9/11? Who wants to be there now? I mean,
look at how the eagerness to get out of Iraq, where you actually could have done imperial things like extract oil and sell it. Instead, we turned over contracts to the Chinese and the French and other countries.
Right. It's the exact opposite of imperialistic,
It's these are just stupid arguments that I just dismiss out of hand anymore. But look, I mean, the point I was trying to make there is that we need to be very careful, given how naive and how poorly we fight these wars, because it's not worth spending U.S. blood and treasure on wars if we're not willing to see them through, if we're not willing to achieve those policy goals.
The only, yeah,
Then
I
we really need to question getting
I
involved.
agree. The only caveat I'd add there, as you know, and we talked about so many times on the podcast and elsewhere, is that part of why these get lumped into the endless wars, and the endless war stuff is on my grievance list too, obviously, because I just think it's shallow rhetoric. I mean, that's not to say there isn't a lot to criticize or there isn't a good case to be made against U.S. involvement in different areas, of course, but the thing is that it gets around the fact that the jihadis are principally insurgents. I mean, that's what they are, and that's how they war fight, and so they're basically designed or built to fight indefinitely. That's the problem. That's the fundamental problem. When people talk about the endless wars and that sort of rhetoric, I mean, part of the critique is that people want, I think some Americans want a Jacksonian style victory. They want a quick, swift war, which I get. I mean, that's the ideal, right? The problem is that as we've talked, and we're going to have another episode about this specifically when it comes to Afghanistan, there have been very few opportunities post 9/11 to have that Jacksonian style victory in this conflict, and the U.S. didn't take it for one reason or another. So that, and by Jacksonian victory, I mean a sort of a swift, clear defeat of our enemies and just get out. You're done, right? The problem is that they are set up to avoid that sort of thing. They being the jihadis, whether Al Qaeda, ISIS, or their allies, they're set up to basically keep fighting indefinitely. And then the times that the U.S. possibly could have, unwound these insurgencies and really done damage to them. The U.S. did damage to the ISIS caliphate for sure, basically working through proxies and allies and partners. Okay, and it's done damage at others at different times as well. But basically, there was never been sort of any recognition that this was going to be indeed a long war if you're going to keep fighting them. I mean, the name of the Long War Journal, was sort of a concept that bubbled up very briefly in defense circles and then went by the wayside, right, Bill?
Yeah, exactly. And Tom, I could not agree with you more. If keeping a lid on the problem or containing a problem is your policy objective because you don't want to commit a lot of troops to, let's say Somalia, fine. Let's be clear about that. Let's say, make the case to the American public why there's a need to fight a limited war, and then fight it. And then keep explaining, explain that Shabab's our enemy, it's a part of Al Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera.
Have the debate.
But that's
have the debate.
Yeah, have the conversation, have the debate. Not every war, these wars, particularly as you perfectly noted, Jacksonian victories are going to be few and far between. I would have argued that we may have had an opportunity, and I can't wait till we do this episode, Tom, with the Battle of Tora Bora certainly may have been an opportunity to do that. We can't build a time
Operation
machine.
Jawbreaker, and the sort of the mythology around the success of that early invasion of Afghanistan, which we're going to debunk in a future sort of episode.
I can't wait. And so but this is your point is 100% correct. We have communicating to the American public why we engage in conflict is key, but this is something.
Well, I would say that before even communicating it, you have the debate, right? I mean, this is
sure,
this is part of the critique that I actually agree with, is that I think Congress needs to do more in terms of
absolutely,
authorizing military force, and there needs to be more of a debate had through the elected representatives of the American people about where and when U.S. troops are deployed and how this go about it. Instead of sort of, I was looking at, I don't want to get off on a whole tangent here on this stuff, but I was looking, for example, at Somalia because of the U.S. limited involvement there, and the limited number of troops are being sort of withdrawn in neighboring countries. And I was just going back through it, and I was thinking to myself, how did the U.S. actually get involved? How did they actually get involved there, right? Like this is the part of the critique of all this that I actually agree with you and I have agreed with, right? It should be the case that this it shouldn't be happening like on autopilot, right? Where the U.S. military is all of a sudden sent into a place and there's no big debate about what we're doing or how the U.S. is doing it. I mean, I think that needs to be had. Now, I think where we differ from, so we agree with the critics on that one. Where you and I differ is that, they would play disconnect the dots on Shabab. We'd say, no, sure, Shabab is part of Al Qaeda, Now, if you still don't want to go into Somalia or you want to get involved, okay, but don't tell me Shabab, which is openly loyal to Al Qaeda, and there's a whole evidentiary trail here that makes that very clear how that works. Don't tell me they're not Al Qaeda, But the point is at least have the debate, have the discussion about that, have it about all these different areas. And so I agree with that. I think that that's part of the reason why that things have devolved the way they have, is that the process that the U.S. should have for getting involved in these conflicts should be more deliberate. It should be more thought out. It should be more robust on the Hill. There needs to be more of a sort of a debate about this stuff, right, Bill? Like a formal legislative debate, I would say.
Absolutely. The Congress's acquiescence on the issues of war wasn't on my list, but it definitely should.
It was
be
on my
there
list,
for
which is
all
why
the
I brought it
reasons.
up. So
That's great, Tom, and you're thinking ahead. Look, I could tell you how and why we got involved in Somalia.
Sure.
But this is.
But I was asking the specific sort of like, in terms of legislation, in terms of,
Sure. Oh, no,
like,
exactly.
In terms of how did this actually become a decision made? And that's a part of the problem, right? Is that how the decision is made is not part of a process involving the American people and their elected representatives, and communication from political leaders,
These wars are so small that the president can sort of. They want to fight these wars like Somalia or Yemen sort of on the down low because they're low intensity conflicts, right? Where you don't need to commit a large number of troops. You're not going to declare, who are you declaring war on in Somalia?
Right.
A terrorist group? Who are you declaring war on in Yemen? So Congress doesn't feel the need to get involved in these. So, but but that is the root of the problem.
Yeah, that's the mistake.
So Congress isn't involved in these conflicts at the beginning. There is no discussion of them, and then they wind up in we think that our involvement is helping. I'm not saying our involvement's making it worse. I don't buy into those arguments. Look at Syria. The U.S. didn't get involved in Syria early on and had to later because it blossomed. But these conflicts, these terror groups are effective. They're efficient. They have deep ties with the local communities. And so these conflicts grow slowly over the time. And the next thing you know, oh shit, we now have 700 troops involved in fighting Shabab in Somalia. And then that actually almost looks like some kind of war. And then people are like, how did this happen? How did, if, as you said, Tom, if Congress is involved in the early decision-making process of these, we will have far fewer problems.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is, if the U.S.
if
it's decided that the U.S. doesn't go into place through this process, then so be it. That's the decision. You have to. We'll document. I'll be glad to document whatever the decision is, however it goes. I mean, have a debate about it, have a discussion about it. But I think this is the more I thought about this and what's actually driving this. I think this is a big part of it. I mean, part of it is that you have the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, was formalized in 2001. By the way, looking through the Somali coverage, I'm not a legal expert, so I can't say for certainty, but it looks like that the conflict in Somalia was not actually begun under the 2001 AUMF, at least based on some of the commentary I saw. There's other legal justifications for it. Okay, I mean, this is the point, though, is this gets all murky in terms of how the decision-making is done, all this stuff. Now, look, I mean, you're going to have, like, the Rand Pauls of the world, who there's never going to be a conflict that Rand Paul is going to want to get involved in, right? I mean, you can...
Well, let's have that debate.
Right, exactly.
I'd love to have that debate with Rand.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right.
And there are going to be zealots on the other side who are going to want to get involved in every conflict, right? And so, but the point is that at least have a sort of a process or a real argument and debate about this stuff on the Hill through legislation, so that it's actually the will of the American people is represented. And then what happens is you have politicians run for or against this stuff. Instead of just sort of, now basically this is part of my big grievance. All this, we sort of devolved into this sort of blame America first sort of mantra on all these issues, where there's plenty of critiques you can be made, of course, but it's sort of now in this sort of scenario where everything is America's fault. That it's not America's fault the Taliban has fought on in Afghanistan. I mean, America's tried to extricate itself from that conflict numerous times, as you and I know, since 2012, really. But the point is, at least in terms of all these wars, in terms of all these conflicts, which a lot of them are low intensity conflicts now from the American side, at least have a real robust discussion about why America is there, if it should be there, and what's actually the point of being there in the first place, right?
Yeah, and Tom, and these conflicts are never put into the wider context, right? There's a war in Shabab, and that's wholly unrelated to fighting AQAP in Yemen, which is wholly unrelated to fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. But if someone was to take and put this picture together and say, we're pressuring an enemy that's united on multiple fronts, there's a need to fight him that way, it helps people understand. Like, what drives me crazy is I talk to people, who aren't in this, friends or acquaintances that, hey, what do you do, Bill, for a living? And then you ultimately have that uncomfortable discussion about what I do for a living. And they'll ask questions. And I find that people get this. The average American has an intuition about the enemy that we're fighting, whereas it seems our politicians who are closer to the issue and analysts and others, they seem to not understand these issues. I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but I'd love to see the American public have a wider involvement in this, and that debate comes through Congress.
Yeah.
That's why I would like to see this.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to one of my big items on the grievance list is sort of the epistemology of all this and the ignorance that still, after all these years, I think from the people we've talked to, there's better agreement now in U.S. government circles about, for example, how Al Qaeda is structured, right, and what it looks like and that sort of thing. But certainly in the wider sort of counterterrorism analytic community, there's no agreement at all. And there's stuff that's sort of assumed, and then these elaborate analyses are built on these assumptions. Basically, one of the things that you and I have talked about quite a few times is that this is where I get the disconnect the dots phrase from, is that there's sort of this inherent drive to basically pretend like every Al Qaeda group isn't really Al Qaeda. We saw that with Shabab in Somalia. You and I were almost alone in saying, no, you're wrong. There is a relationship there between them and Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda is actually embedded throughout the Islamic Courts Union, and then Shabab evolved out of that. We've seen that time and time again across the board. Now, obviously, in some of these areas, that doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. wants to get involved. I'm just, basically have to sort of get the analysis right of what's actually going on, however. And I guess one of my grievances is that this many years that we're sitting here in 2020 going into 2021, and I'm still reading stuff that I'm going to have another example as one of my other grievances. You still read stuff that just basically tells you there's not a common understanding of this at all at this point.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I couldn't agree. Well said. It's one of my biggest grievances that we cannot define this enemy 19 plus years after 9/11. It's amazing. It's astounding. It's a testament to our poor political leadership, to intelligence analysts and leaders of the intelligence.
Yeah, I think there's some good analysts in the intelligence community.
There's some,
yeah,
but Tom, it's not. This isn't something that's spoken with a unified voice.
No.
And we've seen intelligence politicized time and time again on these issues. That's how you got the stupid 50 to 100 Al Qaeda, and we could point to numerous other, right? Remember at the beginning of the Iraq war, or the Islamic State's rise, just 20,000 Islamic State fighters.
It was even less than that. Yeah, it was like, there was a range. I mean, there's the whole counting.
It was 20,000 to 30.
There's 13.5 to 21.5 or something like that. That was the original number. It was some. Yeah, whatever. But the thing is, it's like part of that is politicization, but part of that, the politicization was calling it the JV team and downplaying it and doing all that stuff, which is what the Obama administration did. It wasn't the counting problem. I think was more reflects the epistemological problems, the issues here. In terms of defining all this. In terms of how this all works. Again, I think this is why I led off this episode with ambivalence as my number one sort of a grievance, is that you can't have ambivalence in any of these conversations, discussions on this stuff. Because if you've just listened to all the other subcategories we've just listed off, there's ambivalence throughout all of them, right? On all these issues. I'm going to come back to one of the related issues for you, Bill, on this. I think it's going to tie into one of yours. But when it comes to epistemology and sort of the lack of a common understanding, here's one of my grievances too, is that so on August 7th of this year, the Israelis killed Abu Muhammad al-Masri and his daughter in a suburb of Tehran, and he was the deputy emir of Al-Qaeda at the time. And, this is one of those issues where maybe people should have stopped to say, hey, why was this top guy from Al-Qaeda, and others, by the way, why were they in Iran? And why were they being protected there? Is there actually a history here that's worth exploring of details and facts from the 9/11 Commission report and other sources? But instead of doing that, you just had this sort of reflexive, what was he doing in Iran? How could that be? And it's like, what are you talking about? Have you actually been paying attention? You go through the 9/11 Commission report or other official sources, and you can find this whole standard history analyst stuff. There's all sorts of facts and evidence that you have to understand. It doesn't mean that they're always on the same side. Hardly, they're against each other. But I saw sort of that example, that report or that story was a good example of how the sort of the preconceived biases sort of play out, right? Basically, there was this sort of collective sort of, you know, feigning of ignorance about why Al Qaeda would have senior personnel in Iran after all these years, where it wasn't surprising to you or me, Bill.
No, not at all. I mean, the same newspapers that reported about these relationships, about senior Al Qaeda leaders sheltering inside of Iran, are all of a sudden confused and bewildered by the fact that we kill Al Qaeda's deputy.
By the way, on that point, look, the New York Times, does a lot of great reporting. It does, and there's some of the stuff that it produces really excellent. And so this is not an ideological bash the New York Times type of session for me at all. Okay.
No, not at all.
But
I wasn't going to name names.
Well, but it was in the Times article where they said it was surprising to find Abu Muhammad al-Masri in Iran. No, it wasn't, folks. Right? There were all sorts. There's a whole story there. Yeah. You have to know the whole story, but there is a whole story there. But I look back through it, and what was funny about it is the New York Times was one of the publications that when the 9/11 Commission report came out, and they found all these ties between Iran and Al Qaeda, they reported on that in the New York Times. There's all sorts of other reports in the New York Times about Iran and Al Qaeda that would tell you there's more to the story than just they're opposed to each other because of theological differences. That there is that whole history there. We're going to do this. We're going to do a whole episode on this. But yet that stuff wasn't consulted, and it was almost like there's such a lack of understanding of these issues that basically when something like this happens, it's instead of saying, hey, this is a complicated story, we have to take into account all these different facts and evidence and everything. It's just sort of this rush to say, oh, no, it's all surprising and there's no way this could be because they're just bitter enemies and they're not really on the same side. They couldn't possibly work together at all. And it just, to me, it just shows such a limited understanding of human behavior. And obviously, this goes to a part of my grievance list as well. What's that rooted in? I don't want to speak to the motivations of those individual reporters in that case. But broadly speaking, when we talk about Iran, Al Qaeda, one of the things I've run into is that it's sort of this reflexive sort of thing that you're just trying to justify war against Iran by bringing it up, right? Even though I've written consistently against that, doesn't matter. You still see that. And that's sort of one of my grievances is that, a lot of stuff for ideological reasons gets reduced down to questions of war making as opposed to just what the facts are,
Yeah, right. I mean, as we said early on in this episode and numerous other times, let's get the facts right. Then we could talk about policy. And as you and I both said, we're numerous times on these podcasts, we're very hesitant about rushing into a new war when we can't properly settle or prosecute the ones we're currently in, and one that we've negotiated. What I essentially believe at this point is negotiated our own defeat in Afghanistan. So you think I want to rush into going to war
or anywhere else? For that matter,
or anywhere else, just because Al Qaeda's But let's recognize the fact that Al Qaeda happens to be sheltering or Iran happens to be sheltering senior Al Qaeda leaders. Then we'll go from there and discuss it. But we got to get the facts right. We can't even get the facts.
And by the way, we're sitting here in 2020, and how many times through the years have we heard this is all about trying to gin up a war with Iran? And we're here in 2020. It's 19 years after 9/11. When did the war with Iran begin exactly? When did the U.S. We had the Seymour Hersh articles and
that's exactly what I was going to. I remember I tallied it up at one point in time where it was basically he said every year we were going to war with Iran. That year, I think I did it in like 2009. I wanted to say, and then he stopped because Obama became president, and then I started seeing the Trump administration was trying to go to war with Iran when. Yeah, it's very frustrating. I mean, again, if you mention basic facts, you're branded as a warmonger.
By some in this debate, I think most of our readers get who we are. Most of our listeners get who we are.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah. Absolutely. When we're talking about branding, you're talking about the way things work in Washington, where there's just all sorts of problems in that town. Period. So I'll just say period, and we'll leave it there. Those. I think I've got one other sort of grievance on here. I don't know if you have. I'm sure you have other ones. I'll finish my.
I do.
I'll finish my list.
You want to go ahead?
Finish my list, and then you can talk about your list.
Sure.
The last thing on mine is social media. As listeners of the podcast know, I don't like social media. I don't like being on social media. Social media has a junior high school vibe to me. I did not like junior high school. I did not like the junior high school vibe. Right. And a lot of the stuff I see on social media, it's a lot of people trying to dunk on each other. We've also developed a few little cyber stalkers on social media. I know, we're not going to name them obviously on the show, but some weirdos out there who get obsessed with our stuff for their own ideological reasons or because they have their own personal hangups. Whatever it is, I don't really care. If you're listening to this, if you're one of those people and you're listening to this, go get a life, do something else. Take a long walk, whatever. Have a scotch, have a beer, whatever. Just get over yourself, get over us. And just move on with yourself, because it's really, it's just bizarre, it's just really strange. And there's a lot going on in the world. But social media, to me, has unleashed all sorts of behaviors within humanity that are not so great. There are benefits to it for sure. There's communication benefits. There are times where good causes get promoted. One of the things I think year end is you see a lot of GoFundMe's for people who legitimately need help, especially in this trying time. And some of the ways you get exposed to that through social media, through Twitter, I think that's great stuff. There's all sorts of people out there who legitimately are sort of desperate for help right now. And that's why I kicked this off by saying, in reality, I don't really have any grievances when I see people who are suffering out there. But for every example like that I see just a lot of vitriolic nonsense, and every time I log on to Twitter, which is not very often, I often wonder, how much is it disinformation or bad information or misinformation or just outright abject idiocy versus sort of something that's really informative or worthwhile. And I really struggle with that, looking at the whole thing. I know you're barely on Twitter as well, right, Bill?
Yeah, I try to just say no, but unfortunately you can't. It's part of the job, so I do a minimal effort. I'm with you. If you could go and build a time machine and people say, well, I'd go kill Adolf Hitler or whatever. I think I might prevent the rise of social media. I think that might be the thing. The one good I can do humanity would be to destroy any ability for social media to come into being. I don't know. I haven't really figured out how that would be done. And probably would get pretty bloody, but yeah, I think it'd be worth it.
In terms of the downsides of all this, I mean, again, not saying there aren't any positives, but in terms of downsides of all this, I mean, it's well recognized, for example, and it's even overplayed, but it's still true that ISIS capitalized off of social media like no other. I mean, the rise of ISIS I'm still planning on an episode on that, trying to bring some folks in to talk about it a little bit more and exactly how ISIS did it. We know some of the details, of course. But ISIS, beginning in 2013, 2014 in particular, capitalized on social media. That's part of how they built their, short-lived caliphate and how they were able to disseminate their message and woo followers and that whole thing, and how they built the whole marketing campaign around what they were doing. It sort of shows you that, the bad actors are able to exploit this pretty easily,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't promote a somewhat half-baked conspiracy theory. You'll get banned from Twitter or even in some cases legitimate news stories. However, you could be the Taliban spokesman and not be taken down for 3 years. So when you see things like this, and he's promoting videos of attacks and all kinds of horrific stuff that Twitter is clearly aware of, but hey, he's the Taliban spokesman, so he could stay on. When I see inequities like that, I think the whole thing just needs to go. But unfortunately, it's part of our world, and there's no turning back. Social media is here to stay, and I think I'm going to dig a deep, deep hole and bury myself into it.
Yeah, I'm going to bury myself away from it. That's what I do. One of my only parting advice before we move on to the remaining year grievances, Bill, is turn it off. If I were to talk to listeners, just turn it off. Don't look at it at a certain point. Sometimes we see people take swipes at us on stuff. I don't reply to much of it. If there's like an informed sort of critique, I may engage with it. But if it's just some imbecile railing against us, just forget it. And most of the interactions we have on social media are actually positive, right? So I say that, but most of the people who kind of get us or try and figure out what we're talking about, even so, most of the stuff we see is positive. But still, I think that in terms of our work and what we're doing, but still, I see quite a bit of negativity, quite a bit of bad stuff out there, and social media, I think, is amplifying a lot of crap and from all sides. And I just think that if my advice to listeners is get off it, don't be on Twitter all the time, don't be on Facebook all the time. Just go read a book, do something else.
Yeah, anything else.
Don't watch the New York Football Giants these days, but do anything else, right?
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, Tom, because that is actually on my list of grievances.
I think I anticipated something from you here.
Um, look, you listeners are spared this because you don't have video, but every week I got to see Tom's damn New York Giants baseball cap on top of his head. And if you're not aware, I'm an Eagles fan, and yes, I am very depressed in these days. So soon after a Super Bowl, but looking at that New York Giants hat, Tom, I got a problem with
It's
that.
not a hat, by
You're
the
gonna
way. I've
have
got
to.
a whole collection of my.
Yeah, I had a feeling that there were
I
others.
This is
but,
actually a different one this week than last week. I unfurl one each one. I was wondering if you had noticed that I basically wear a different one almost every week. So
I just identify them as New York
yeah,
hats, and then it all just sort of goes into a mash, and I hate you more and more for it every day, every week. But I'm only kidding. Tom and I are both huge football fans, and we have some great conversations about football. And even though our teams are in the same division, we both we analyze football. I think, Tom, like we
yeah.
analyze,
If actually if the
jihadism.
sports media market wasn't so cluttered, I could see an alternative reality in which I'd
Yes.
want to do that. I mean, it's just because I'm very much into the analytics on the football side and figuring out what's going on, and everything, and you know, am
It's in jest. Tom, keep wearing those hats, and I'll keep.
Well, one of the funny things is during this trying time, one of the reasons why I wear hats on this call, on Zooms, a lot of times when we're doing this recording is because during the pandemic, it's less frequent for me to get a haircut, so. And so you shave your head, Bill, so you got it easy when it comes to stuff like managing a thick mane of hair. That's not a problem you have to deal with, right, Bill? So
It's not a problem, and I got to tell you, I just wish it didn't grow back at this point, so I didn't have to shave it because that's a pain. But
that was my little dig at you there, but I got you. So
it's all good. I like
I
it.
turned the
actually,
hat
at this
conversation back on you. So
my next grievance, though, a little more serious, is that our U.S. Military leadership. I'm talking about our general officers here. I think people who've listened to this show long enough will probably have an idea of what I'm going to say here. I'm going to keep it brief, though. I'm going to just be very specific. I got a lot of problems with how our military leaders have become politicized. How Afghanistan, again, was the perfect example of this. You had, failed generals rise to the top level of military command. General Dumford's probably a great example. His previous job before becoming chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was head of ISAF, or International Security Assistance Force, which became Resolute Support, which was the NATO command in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was falling apart on his watch, and he was awarded with chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. We could talk about other fail upward generals. I'm not going to mention them, so I got a problem with that. But but I'm going to drill it down a little bit further. And by the way, military officers here, I'm not talking about you lieutenants and captains and majors and colonels. You guys are great. When I would embed with you guys out in the field, you were all professionals, and I miss those times. Maybe I'll get that opportunity again. But I'm talking about our generals, our admirals. Just stop groveling to our enemies, please. Every time the Taliban conduct a major attack, I got to hear a general begging the Taliban to return to the peace table, so-called peace table, to reduce violence, to do this. Just stop already. We have an official branch of the U.S. government that's designed to grovel to our enemies. It's called the State Department. Let's let them do that, and then you go ahead and prosecute the wars against our enemies, and we'll be fine. Like, why do our generals need to suck up to the Taliban or things like this? It's humiliating, frankly, and I have a really, really big problem
that's some hot fire there. I like that.
with that.
That's part of why we do the podcast, though, is to let it out. But there's to make an additional point on that, right? It's almost like if the generals actually did stick to war fighting and try to actually win wars or win battles, right? And I'm going to get to, I guess I'm going to add a grievance on top of here.
No, go for it.
If they actually did that, then maybe we'd have a better understanding of what's going on, or a clearer sort of debate about, what's going on, instead of just sort of saying, okay, everything's fine, everything's rosy, and it's a stalemate in Afghanistan, everything's okay, we can just keep doing what we're doing. If there was actually pressure to perform, to win, as opposed to that, then maybe the outcome would be a little bit different. I don't know.
I could not agree with you more, Tom. That's what I'm getting to. Do your job as a general. Prosecute the wars against our enemies. If the government wants to, the U.S. government wants to negotiate with at her group or something. Let the State Department do it, and you be there. Don't grovel to the Taliban when they kill people in Ghazni or kill women and children. Just go ahead and launch an airstrike and say we got more of that in the tank for you, and let our State Department individuals. I won't use a derogatory term. I love you guys in the State Department too. You're all good. But
well, not everybody, right? But a lot of them.
Most of them. I have friends in the State.
See our conversation on Zalmay Closad, right? So,
yeah, it goes to the top. So yeah, that's it. I mean, I like, I guess I'm old school. I like my generals to be Pattons and Sherman.
And by the way, another related point on that, and this is a corollary point, is that if a situation is not tenable, if it's not sustainable, if it isn't something that's going to lead to a defined outcome where the military can actually achieve something definitive, right? And basically have clear successes, then say so. Right. I mean, if the political winds are erratic and basically the war fighting decision making out of Washington is erratic because the political class is erratic on something, there's no reason to go along with that. Right. You can say, yeah. Oh, look, I mean, Afghanistan, it could have said, instead of going along with, remember the Taliban's momentum has been broken. Remember that whole thing in Afghanistan, which we debunked at the time, which, again, cuts against the idea that we're trying to cheerlead the war effort. Quite the opposite. You and I stood alone or virtually alone in saying, no, the Taliban's momentum has not been broken based on your own statistics, instead of going along with that, it would have been nice if somebody stood up and said, this isn't working and it isn't going to work, and we have to have a conversation about what we're going to do here or not do here,
And Tom, that gets back to the political part, right? Because they're a lot of these guys are so interested in their next command, getting that next star, rising to the top, that they can't admit failure. And so, you got a really perverse incentive structure here for generals to lie about what's happening in combat theaters, and they're doing a disservice to the American public, and they're doing a disservice to their own soldiers who are fighting and dying for them and for the American public. And frankly, it all disgusts me. And I wish it would stop, but I see no end to this in sight.
Well, this is why I meant my additional grievance. So recently, I think it's General Lloyd Austin, President-elect Biden has said that Lloyd Austin was going to be his nominee for SecDef, Secretary of Defense. And this became, I guess, controversial because he's going to require a waiver, just as General Mattis did to become SecDef, because he hasn't been out of military service long enough to avoid the waiver. So Congress is certainly having some pushback on this, which I applaud. I think we should have maintained civilian leadership in Pentagon.
Yeah.
Mattis shouldn't have gotten a waiver, and neither should Austin.
Couldn't agree more.
We need civilian oversight. But so the Biden team responds to that with a defense of Austin. And the first thing that President-elect Biden cited in his defense of Austin was it winning a battle? Was it winning a war? No, it was Austin oversaw the orderly withdrawal from Iraq. I mean, come on. I mean, that's not exactly going to go down in the history books with Sherman and Marshall and all these other people, right? I mean, it's sort of like, what the heck, and of course, the withdrawal from Iraq actually fueled the rise of ISIS, helped fuel the rise of ISIS instead of keeping a residual force there, at the time. So anyway, the point is that,
Tom, the one individual who had more visibility on the situation in Iraq and the status of ISIS in both Iraq and Syria would have been General Austin, and he cheerleaded for the withdrawal. And
well, I've seen some reports that he actually recommended a residual force there and was overruled. And I guess he got into it with Michelle Flournoy on this, who was another possible candidate for being Secretary of Defense. Whatever. I don't need to get into all history there. I mean, the point is that if that's really all you can cite, is that he, if that's the first thing out of your mouth is he got us out of Iraq,
But Tom, how about, you know what? I can't agree with this policy. I'm going to resign. Please have someone else manage this withdrawal. Thank you. I've served my country. You could either move me or move me out. I mean, name a general that's resigned in 19 years of war because of disagreement, legitimate disagreement on policy. I think the number is 0. I don't expect that number to grow.
Yep. You have any other grievances for this episode?
Yeah, this one's definitely something you're not going to like. Look, the fact is that Ibn Khattab.
Oh, here we go with the Chechen gear again. We're going on to the Chechen gear. Oh, God.
Tom, he's the king of jihadist fashion.
We're going for Chechen jihadi swag. Is that what we're talking about again now?
Listen, if anyone who denies the fact that he was the king of jihadi fashion, I got a big problem with you, man. When you could mix urban camouflage with woodland camouflage with that black and white spotted fur hat, and have a club hand because a grenade blew up in your hand, explosive blew up in your hand. I mean, come on, man. How could you not like Ibn Khattab? If you were jihadist, you would want to be dressed like him and emulate him. You know it's true, Tom. Just anyone who disagrees with this, I got a big problem with you. And that's
all I'm going to say is you're objecting to my wearing of a New York Giants hat, but you're liking Ibn Khattab's hat. That's all I'm going to say.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think Ibn Khattab is better than the New York Giants.
Oh boy.
I said it. There it is.
Well, now you're an Ibn Khattab apologist. You should I got some Taliban apologists for you to look up there, Bill. I got some Taliban apologists for you to talk to because there's some people you can chat with on that.
The reality is he was a monster, and I'm glad he's dead. But he certainly could sport the jihadi fashion.
And by the way, there was a whole disconnect the dots effort on him, as you talked about.
Yeah, right.
Chechens,
absolutely.
And
I mean, look, he's the Che Guevara of jihadists. What can you say? There should be a T-shirt of him with that hat.
And of course, there shouldn't be a T-shirt of Che Guevara either. So right.
But if I got to see Che, I got to see.
Yeah, I would rather see either one of them. Neither one of them. But yes, that is what it is. I think that's it. Do you have anything else?
I've aired my grievances, which are really quite minor in the bigger scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm repeating myself, but 2020 has been a rough year for a lot of people. I certainly have not fared as nearly as poorly as a lot of other people have, and I just look around right now, what's going on, and it's just I don't know. Hopefully 2021 is a better year. That's all I can say, right?
Yep, that's it. Again, a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. Happy holidays to all of our listeners, to you and your families. Thank you so much for supporting us over the years.
Yeah, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in again this week, or I guess we're going to have a couple episodes within a week here. This is sort of, we're trying to do something different with this podcast. As you can tell, this is raw. This is probably the type of stuff that will get us in trouble someday, but so be it. We're just trying to give you sort of our unfiltered sort of take on things because that's just the way it is. And we hope you appreciate that and like it and keep listening to the podcast. If you could, I guess, again, I haven't even looked this up, as I keep saying, but on Apple Podcasts, I guess you can tune in and give us a 5-star rating if you can. That helps drive other people to the podcast if you like it. If you like it and you want to do that, we appreciate it. That helps, I guess, with certain algorithms I don't understand in terms of driving traffic. That'd be great. But in any event, thank you for listening again to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. We're going to keep coming at you with episodes. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts, and we will see you again soon.